crazy that Dave Smith will just, rush out of nowhere to white knight for Joe Rogan. He's like, Joe, no, don't get up off the toilet. Let me wipe your ass. Oh, you're more of a bidet man. Don't worry. I'll use my tongue and don't worry, Joe. I got you, Joe. Oh, don't worry. I'll give you, I'll polish you off, a little baby powder, coming out of the woodwork, man. And that's for a man that eats only meat. So you don't know what you're dealing with over here. But anyway, our man Kyle, he's been taking Rogan to task. He's been talking about how he's completely backtracked on a bunch of critical issues. How if you want to call it an ideological pivot, you'd be being really generous. What it really seems like is a quick cash grab and insulating himself around people who are only yes men, who are only indulging in his worst, most pathetic instincts. And he's been molded like clay to regurgitate a lot of their talking points. But that's a bridge too far for Dave Smith. He can't face the reality. This man's a libertarian. He loves to live in fantasy land. What were your thoughts before we get into this, Gavin?
Well, it's interesting because Dave Smith's a weird character. Like I said, I feel like he's sort of Jimmy Dore if Jimmy Dore hadn't destroyed his brain matter with 1 million gallons of whiskey or something. You know what I'm saying? Like he you listen to him and he doesn't totally come off like a dumbass, right? But you listen to him for too long and eventually it all falls apart. Like I said, it's an interesting guy. Kyle has actually spoken with Dave Smith in the past. Same with Crystal Ball. They've had him on their podcast, had a very pleasant conversation. They both seem to be fans of his work. So I was a little bit surprised to see the intensity with which Dave comes at Kyle here. I kind of hope it results in a debate or something, because Dave Smith and his loser co-host here have some pretty harsh words for Kyle. I must say, I'm excited to respond to some of this.
Yeah, this dude looks like, not a big toe, like maybe the third or fourth toe. You know what I mean? Anyway, let's watch.
Rob, when Anthony Jeselnik was trashing Legion of Skanks. And I only saw this because, I was involved. So that's to the extent of why I cared about what Anthony Jeselnik was saying. But he said at one point
Anthony Jeselnik's kind of based, but whatever.
He talked about
based.
Oh, I didn't even know who that was.
He's kind of funny. I've never watched his stand up, but I've seen him make some pretty good cases on podcasts before. And I think this guy hates him because he's talked shit on Rogan.
Ann Coulter used to come hang at the Comedy Cellar. I don't know if you remember this, Rob. This might have been a little bit before you started stand-up, but Ann Coulter used to come to the Comedy Cellar. That was like a known thing. She would come and she would hang out. She was friends with some of the comedians. And Jeselnik was talking about how disgusted he was that Ann Coulter was like hanging out with the comedians. And I remember when I saw it, just thinking to myself, it's like, this is the kind of the unseen, like this is progressive privilege that they don't even recognize. Because if you're not a progressive, that's every single day in New York City. Every single day, there's some progressive hanging out there. It's just you're upset by the one time that there was actually like a conservative who was there. Your expectation, in other words, is that those people should never exist.
It's so funny to act like progressives and left-wingers are just like the majority in this country, as if we aren't constantly having to deal with people who completely reject our ideology and outlook on life, even in New York City. This is stupid bullshit. Don't give me this fucking crap that in New York City, everywhere you look, it's nothing but progressives. It's nothing but like blue-haired SJWs or something. I've been to New York. There's a bunch of capitalists there. There's a bunch of Wall Street bankers there.
You ever heard of Wall Street?
Right.
It's basically Disneyland for rich people. Like, you ever heard of the Monopoly board? Okay, yeah. The last chunk, that's New York City.
So it seems to me that one of the things that I think Kyle doesn't like about Rogan is that he'll also talk to the right wingers. That's really kind of your beef, that he's not exclusively talking to left wingers. I don't know. Do you have any thoughts on this, Rob?
Idiot.
Well, my autism was somewhat focused on his concept of vibe-based voters. And firstly, he doesn't really clarify what a vibe-based voter is, or what exactly would be the problem with being a vibe-based voter. I'm pretty sure that
I think most of the country is a vibes-based voter. I just misread the vibe of the country when I was talking about that last.
Yeah, but that's kind of the problem. Yeah. I think that's what Kyle's point is that like everyone's just voting for Trump because he's like, it was really cool when he did the fist pump after the dude shot at him or whatever. and not because of any actual economic prescription or any actual plan to make America great again that would work, right? It's all just like, Kamala and the Democrats seem woke, and the Republicans seem really cool and like pro-America and stuff. That's what Kyle's talking about.
Called voting. And I also don't understand how if there was a category of vibe-based voters, which is different than other voters, I don't understand how being a vibe-based voter makes you not independent media, which then brings me to your point of what exactly is the...
Wait, this guy's dumb, right? And I'm going to withhold my use of the R word in this instance, even though this guy seems like he might be a fellow journeyman. What I will say is completely ridiculous is that what makes him not independent media, what makes him corporate media, is the fact that he's awash with corporate cash, you dumbass. It has nothing to do with the fact that he's a vibes-based voter. Okay, those things happen to exist in cohesion, right? But that doesn't mean that they're the same thing. And your media literacy and your ability to comprehend things, I bring to question when that is your takeaway from Kyle's video.
Yeah, literally, Rogan gets paid over $100 million by Spotify, which is, guess what? Not a mom and pop shop. It's a fucking corporation, if there ever was one. Spotify is the single biggest audio podcasting platform in existence. They exclusively pay Joe Rogan over $100 million a year to run his dumb mouth. I mean, how could you get any more corporate media? Does he have to get paid $500 million a year for it to qualify as corporate media? Like, does there have to be a freaking CNN logo at the bottom of the screen for it to actually count as corporate? Like, it's fucking ridiculous, and everyone knows it. This guy knows it, but he's still gaslighting everyone and white knighting for Joe Rogan, because that's all there is to do in this section of the internet. Suck Joe Rogan's cock and act like he's some independent, alternative, truth-telling fucking soothsayer of the average Joe, when in reality he's just an out-of-touch Rush Limbaugh wannabe.
What exactly is independent media, and how is what Rogan's doing not independent media? Which is just my autism of me saying, what the fuck what's your point, dude? What point? Like, in other words, you seem to have, like, it seems like you're trying to make a point of that he's actually secretly conservative, or secretly has a gender, or secretly is working for someone. But your actual evidence of this is that he's a vibe-based voter. And
I think he meant to say agenda, but he has a weird accent.
A gender.
A gender. Kind of like people who say winder.
Oh, that's hilarious. Joe Rogan secretly has a gender.
Vibe-based voter, you can't be independent media. I don't understand the logic to that at all.
Well, also, if you just think about like what conclusion you would draw from the information that Kyle's given, where he'll go like, hey, look, Rogan regularly had me on his show, and I would make arguments, and he would kind of nod and go, okay, I get your argument. And then he'd have some other guy on his show make some other argument, and he'd nod and say, oh, I get your argument. And now it seems like he's hanging out with those other guys and not.
No, what Kyle is criticizing is the fact that over 4 short years after making a boatload of money, Joe Rogan decided to forfeit his conscience in exchange for being insulated and being jerked off constantly and being worshipped by a bunch of people who view him quite literally as a deity amongst men. He is quite literally, to a lot of people, their own father in a weird parasocial way. Even people who are older than Joe Rogan, grown men, listen to that man with the fervor of a young child sitting on their knees looking up at, Papa, tell me one more time the story of how you met mommy. You know what I mean? That's how these guys look at Joe Rogan. So, I mean, the fact that they're just willfully misunderstanding every single element, it makes sense, but I'm just losing it right here. The guy keeps coming back to, I don't understand how being a vibes-based voter makes you corporate media. To answer your other question, Gavin, he wants to see Joe Rogan on cable news, or it doesn't count as mainstream media. There's nothing else there.
With me. Because my conclusion from that would be like, I guess you lost that argument. I guess he was more persuaded by what they had to say than what you had to say.
No shit.
I don't know.
Yeah, exactly. And what is Joe Rogan, a child? Like, what is Joe Rogan, a child? Does he need to have someone like Kyle Kulinski come in here and like out debate every single right-wing hack that also comes on the Joe Rogan? It's not up to Kyle Kulinski to save Joe Rogan. So no, I mean, even if that was the case, even if Kyle Kulinski just went in there, totally fucked up, made a dog shit argument, embarrassed the left, none of that happened. But say it did, that still wouldn't be an excuse for Joe Rogan to endorse fascism and become like a poster boy of MAGA. Like that's not Kyle's fault. Kyle is upset at Joe because Joe is now saying a bunch of shit that directly contradicts a lot of the values that he used to espouse, which made him popular in the first place. A strong, genuine support of libertarian principles, for example. Joe seemingly actually cared about freedom, cannabis use, stuff like that. He, at one point, would rail against immigration. He would talk about how he would never identify as a Republican because there's nothing more uncool than being part of the Republican Party. And now he has Donald Trump on his podcast and does a completely embarrassing, sycophantic interview. The sort of interview so disgustingly sycophantic that it would never air on cable news. Not that cable news isn't incredibly fucked up and corrupt, but you think freaking Anderson Cooper ever would have administered an interview that pathetic to any politician, including Kamala Harris? You're crazy if you think that. You're crazy. Joe Rogan is a total embarrassment to supposed alternative media. Not even because of the corporate capture, the Spotify money, but just the complete, sycophantic nature in which he presents himself in relation to power. He grovels constantly and refuses to actually challenge powerful people when they come on a show, whether it's CIA agents like Mike Baker or literally Donald Trump. Then behind the back, yeah, exactly. And then behind the back of the left acts like we love the establishment and that the establishment loves us. That's Joe Rogan's big line. Oh yeah, the mainstream media loves the left and hates the right and all this stuff. Well, if this is what we're replacing the mainstream media with, assholes like Joe Rogan who want to give blowjobs to presidential candidates like Donald Trump and refuse to hold them accountable at all, even on issues like COVID, even on issues like the vaccine that Donald Trump was responsible for, Rogan didn't even ask him. He didn't even give a shit. He didn't even care enough to hold Donald Trump accountable on the one issue that he spent 4 fucking years, leading his audience down the rabbit hole of, which was the vaccine and Dr. Fauci and all the shit. Doesn't even care. Can't even inform his audience that actually all happened under Donald Trump. It was all his fucking fault.
I think the other most brazen contradiction of Joe Rogan is something that you touched on, and the often cited Joe Rogan Duncan Trussell clip that was going around when it came to him coldly and clinically and correctly asserting that there are two sides in the world. People who have a heart and soul who say, do not separate those children from their families. Hey, come here. We want to build a country that's good enough for all of us. We want to build a country that supports all of us. We don't want you going back to that place that's unsafe. We sure as shit don't want to rip your child away from you. Are you kidding me? There's two kinds of people in the world, he said. The kinds of people that are okay with that and the kind of people that are not okay with that. And at one point, Joe Rogan switched. Why did he switch? Because it buttered his bread a little better. This guy that's been rich since he was 25 years old. He wanted a little bit more gravy. It's fucking disgusting. And that's why Kyle's pissed off. The fact that Kyle actually believed what he said and thought he convinced Joe Rogan is what makes him pissed off that he hasn't, right? That's why he's coming out here and being like, this guy's a lost fucking cause. Okay, this guy's with the 30% of deranged MAGA. We need to be focusing on the other percentage of the country that we need to win over because those people are more up for grabs. They're not ideologically entrenched. They're not removed from society on a compound in Austin, Texas. They don't have $200 million talking to them every night when they go to sleep, convincing them to accept their most reptilian impulses, right? Hassan Piker talks about how when you get wealthy, you have to kill the reactionary part of your brain. You have to kill the part of your brain that makes you skeptical of everyone else. You have to kill the part of your brain that makes you feel like you are uniquely special, and that's why you navigated all of the quandaries of capitalism. You navigated all of the fucking booby traps. You'll talk to yourself about how, wow, I didn't even have it as easy as most of these other people. Look at what I accomplished, right? And you'll stop to think so much about all the people who helped you along the way and all the, people who sacrificed for you, and how you, like all of us, are a collective effort of our communities and the people who shape us, because we're not just, biology experiments. We're also products of our environment, nature and nurture, right? All these things, right? You start to feel selfish. You start to feel like you're entitled to all of these things. And if you don't actively kill that part of your brain, you're going to become a dog shit person. And we just watched Joe Rogan become that dog shit person in real time. He went from being a guy who you thought you could win to a guy you know is a lost cause. And that's sad. And that's why Kyle's pissed off. And the fact that these two dumbasses are too fucking up their own ass to actually authentically analyze this just lets you know that it's just a boys club for people who want to jerk off Rogan and get access to his celebrity, and not people who want to actually put forth a serious argument.
100%. And also, like, it's not even, to me, it's not even about like Joe Rogan being a good person or a bad person. Like, I don't fucking know this man. He's not my friend. I don't really give a shit about what he does in his personal life, or, you know, whether he goes to heaven or hell or anything like that. What I care about is the actual product, the show, the Joe Rogan Experience. And what I think is undeniable in Rogan's new era is that the quality of said product has gone way downhill. And I think that's also an issue that Kyle has with his former friend, Joe Rogan. When he first went on Joe's show, it's not like Joe Rogan agreed with Kyle on everything or even most things. I think even the first couple times that Kyle went on, they had a lot of debates. They had a lot of disagreements that they hashed out, and it was interesting. That's part of what made the show interesting. But now Rogan is insulated in a bubble, and his show has become an echo chamber, and those kind of interesting conversations and debates just don't happen on the platform. Why? Because Rogan only is now comfortable talking with sycophantic hack comedian friends of his and people that just want to feed into the same sort of echo chamber that he's already created, where it's right-wing slop, dumb conspiracy theories with very little fact checking, and it's just not compelling like it used to be. Joe Rogan actually used to seem like he was an intellectually curious person who was operating in good faith and having conversations with a lot of different folks. But like I said, the first time Kyle went on Joe's show, Joe was not like some, you know, progressive type guy. He was like a Gary Johnson supporting libertarian that was sympathetic to the ideas of Bernie Sanders. But Joe Rogan was never a true, you know, Kyle Kulinski Democrat. No, that's not Kyle's point. And Kyle doesn't need Joe Rogan to be the same as he is. He doesn't need him to have the same ideology. What he's frustrated about, as you mentioned, Zach, is that there's not even a willingness to engage anymore. There's not even a willingness to entertain the perspectives of people that feel otherwise, and people that do want to push back in genuine good faith and try to explain to Joe Rogan how a lot of the stuff he says now and a lot of the stuff he stands for now is, yes, completely in opposition to the values that he used to espouse, which in large part made the show popular.
100%. Very well said. Do you want to play any more of this, Gavin?
Maybe a little bit more.
That's been my attitude, not just with Joe, but with everyone. I remember going on Rogan's podcast last year at some point and being very, very critical of Israel. And then after that, he had several pro-Israel guests on. And my thinking on that was always just like, oh, I gotta really make sure I'm persuasive on this next time I'm on. You know what I mean? Like, I wouldn't say like, oh, therefore it proves that you're the bad guy because you talk to these other people after you talk to me. It's like, I don't know. There's also just so and maybe I'm like guilty of this to some degree, but I also just kind of think there's something where it's like, I don't know, Kyle, so he had you on 4 times or whatever he said on the biggest show. On the biggest show there is. He gave you the biggest platform to let you make the argument to as many people as you could. And if ultimately you didn't persuade his audience and his audience then went in a different direction, how is that not on you? That would be my attitude.
It's a little bit like Peter Hotez if he then goes back on CNN and says, hey, he's
sorry, that's so fucking funny. It's Kyle Kulinski's fault that 20 million dumbasses out there voted for for Donald Trump because the people in Joe Rogan's audience were persuaded by the case he made on the JRE. That's so funny. Kyle, like I said, Kyle did do an amazing job. Pretty much as good as you possibly could have done on that platform. I'm sorry, but I mean, what else was he supposed to do? How much more convincing or compelling could he possibly have made the case or explain this stuff to Joe? The problem is, it's going to get lost in the noise when Kyle Kulinski is one episode sandwiched between 200 right-wing hacks that are all repeating the same fucking crap, that are all contributing to this echo chamber. Yeah, Kyle could do anything, he could say anything, but if you only invite him on 4 times out of 400 episodes, and there's no other real lefties that are there to make the case, then yeah, it's going to get washed out. It's going to be like a sandcastle at sea every single time, again, no matter who you are and how good you do.
And what's crazy is that they actually correctly bring up Peter Hotez as an example of Joe Rogan, changing his mind. But what they don't understand is it's an example of Joe Rogan being a huge hypocrite, right? And intentionally unlearning something that his audience doesn't want him to know. So we had Peter Hotez on, and he's like, man, I've heard a lot of weird shit on the internet from people in Hollywood saying that vaccines cause autism. And they have this great conversation where Peter Hotez is like, oh, that is gaining a lot of steam right now. Here's, why that's not true. There's no medical evidence for that. And also, like, I mean, would you really rather have your kid die of measles just because they're going to be neurodivergent? Like, that's kind of Hitlerian, right? But anyways, he did a great job of doing that in the podcast, right? They had a great conversation, and Joe's takeaway was, oh, that's been debunked, right? Vaccines don't cause autism, right? Well, then, the COVID-19 vaccine comes out, and he unlearns everything that Peter Hotez said to him, everything that he, agreed with, everything that he'd kind of parroted on his own podcast. Why? Because there was more money, there was more clicks, and there was more interest among his circle of people who consume his media, and also people who he shares his time with, right? All of the sycophantic goons that want to, set up shop in his asshole out in Austin, Texas, you know what I mean? And try and make their million fishing for a nugget of gold. Anyway, I don't know where I was going with it, but you see what I'm saying.
100%. About Hotez, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. It's like, that's actually, we'll play the...
It's another illustration of exactly the issue that Kyle has with Rogan. People like himself and Hotez have explained a lot of these concepts to him, and now Rogan wants to turn around and act ignorant and be like, I don't know.
It's maddening.
It's only having on anti-vaccine people. And it's like, well, you kind of went on there and weren't all that honest or persuasive and refused to debate anybody. So you're not really a very credible personality.
It's not credible to be like, I don't want to debate a crank that doesn't know anything and act like he's on equal footing with me, a real doctor who's only going to cite real studies, when he's going to constantly pull shit out of his ass that I've never heard of and use that as a gotcha to be like, well, you're not really well researched because you haven't heard of this bullshit, non-peer reviewed phony study.
Yep. And by the way, I actually originally was critical of that dude's decision to not come on Rogan and debate the issue. I was like, come on, bro, just do it. Like, what do you have to lose? Like, let's get this done. You're clearly going to clobber these morons or whatever. But then what happened was the debate on Rogan's podcast between Flint Dibble and Graham Hancock. And Flint Dibble, who's an actual archaeologist, a real scientist, totally crushed Graham Hancock. It was undeniable. It was a completely humiliating expose, frankly. No one in their right mind who watched that debate would come away from it thinking that Graham Hancock was anything less than thoroughly humiliated. Even his own fans will tell you that. But despite that, what happened? 3, 4, 5 months later, Joe Rogan has on Graham Hancock, and behind Flint Dibble's back, starts talking about how actually Flint Dibble lied, and actually Graham Hancock did win that debate, even though it was universally considered to be a total L for Hancock. And now on a daily basis, they smear Flint Dibble and mock him and act like he spread misinformation and is just another, snooty academic and all this stuff. And they've turned their whole, cultish audience against him. This poor guy who's just a scientist type, an educator,
an archaeologist,
right? And that's what would happen to Peter Hotez as well. Even if he had gone on there, even if he had crushed RFK or whatever moron anti-vax nut job that Rogan wanted him to debate, even if Peter Hotez had totally crushed him, it wouldn't have mattered, because they would have, decided on whatever narrative they wanted to and ran with it and smeared the guy anyway and acted like he was a stupid dolt and a dweeb and a nerd and all this stuff, because they don't give a fuck about facts, and they don't give a fuck about science. They don't give a fuck about anything other than whatever brain dead conspiracy is being promoted on X or Facebook or whatever, slop driven algorithm tells them what to believe.
Yep. Great point. We can play a little bit more of this before moving on.
Anymore.
Yeah, I mean, like, let's just say, for example, because Joe he has me on pretty regularly, and he also has Mike Baker on pretty regularly. Now, Mike Baker, I think me and Mike Baker have about as diametrically opposed foreign policy beliefs as two people could have. But if we both went on the show, and then, like, let's say there was a poll of all of Joe Rogan's audience, and 90% of them agreed with Mike Baker, my conclusion from that would be like, shit, I'm just not doing a good job. I'm not making the case very well. What am I missing? My conclusion wouldn't be like, this is why Joe Rogan and Mike Baker aren't really independent media or something. Not that Mike Baker is independent media, but you get my
No, neither is Joe Rogan, you dumbass. But you don't want to come out and say that because he's your god and you walk on glass around the guy.
point. It wouldn't be like to deride them. I think I would take that as a like, shit, I got to step my game up. You know,
that's a you problem, bro. The fact that you're willing to let this guy lie to you because you care about his audience platform so much because you're so greedy, and the fact that you and Mike Baker both share a capitalist instinct doesn't make you smarter, and it doesn't make Joe Rogan somehow independent that he lets you do that, right? He still takes $100 million or $200 million or however many millions of dollars, because I don't think it was ever fully public. It was just a leaked amount, right? So we don't know. It could have been even more than that. What I'm saying is that it was from a major company like Spotify, which is known for, guess what, exploitation, right? Do you know how many artists they could pay more fairly with $100 million that Joe Rogan didn't need, that he was able to make money live lavishly before the Spotify deal, but he accepted it from a company that did just legitimate workplace malpractice, that forced other artists to starve, that made it so much harder for people of my generation to succeed in music than people of the generation before me, who, guess what, had it way harder to succeed in music than the generation that came before them. Fucked how that works, right? You know what I mean? I don't know. We can keep playing this or be done. But
I also think it's just interesting that like Dave Smith seemingly doesn't actually give a shit about any of the actual real life policy implications that, you know, these politicians will incur, right? He's talking about this all in a total void of actual policy context, which is the opposite of Kyle Kulinski. The reason why Kyle Kulinski is so worked up about Joe and the fact that Joe decided to endorse Donald Trump and have him on his podcast and manufacture consent for his agenda to his audience, Kyle is actually upset about that because of the consequences that will occur IRL, the actual repercussions. Dave Smith just wants to talk about like the art of debate or whatever, the sport of like changing the mind of a dumbass, you know? Oh, if you don't change the dumbass's mind, then it's your fault, not the dumbass, because you didn't properly manipulate him emotionally into thinking like you do. What? No, Joe Rogan's not a child. He should arrive at the correct conclusion because he's a thinking adult. You know what I'm saying? He's a pretty smart guy. Seemingly, he's had a lot of success in this world, even though he comes off like a total dipshit on air. Clearly, you know, he has a little bit going on up there, enough to pull it off, enough to make it this far, right? So Kyle's actually concerned about the world that we're all going to live in, the country that we're all going to live in for at least the next 4 years. That's assuming Donald Trump doesn't go full fascist dictator and shut the democracy down. Dave Smith is just like, yeah, man, if you want to convince him, then you got to debate harder, bro. You got to make a better case, man. Like we're trying to, you know, decide whether we're going to go to Olive Garden or Red Lobster for dinner. And sorry, bro, you didn't make a very compelling case for Red Lobster. I think we're going to go with the endless bread.
Get the shrimp scampi there, bro. It's all good. Yeah,
it's just so disconnected from what any of this actually means.
Look out the door if you hear an ambulance. The Vanguard will be there.